Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into a really powerful and pretty challenging theory about how the media covers war. And we're going to use the conflicts in Laos and Cambodia as our main case study. It's all about this one big idea. Why is it that some victims make the front page? Their stories are everywhere, while others just seem to disappear.
So let's just jump right in with the big question that this whole analysis forces us to ask. It's really about who gets our attention. And a pretty tough truth, right? Why is it that some tragedies become these huge public events that we all mourn together, while others, well, it's like they never even happened. They just seem to vanish from the record.
Okay, so to really get what this argument is about, you've got to understand this core idea, the worthy versus the unworthy victim. Here's the deal. According to this model, a worthy victim is someone who suffers because of an official enemy. Their stories, they get tons of press, all framed with this huge sense of moral outrage. But then you have the unworthy victims. These are the people who suffer because of our own country or our allies. And the analysis we're looking at says their stories, they're pretty much ignored, downplayed, or just treated like, an inconvenient footnote.
All right, so let's see how this whole framework actually plays out. We're going to start with our first case study, Laos. The source we're examining here presents this as the perfect example of a conflict that just created thousands upon thousands of these so-called unworthy victims. It was a war that got incredibly intense, but for most people back in the US, it was basically invisible.
So if you look at this timeline, a pretty clear pattern starts to emerge. The argument here is that U.S. intervention, again and again, seemed to get in the way of any peaceful political solution in Laos. You see it right there in 1958. A left-wing party wins an election. And suddenly, there's all this pressure that, according to the source, leads to that government getting tossed out. And all of this just spirals and spirals until it becomes this massive, secret bombing campaign. I mean, by 1968, the scale of it was just unbelievable.
And here's the really crazy part. It's not like nobody knew this was happening. There were eyewitness accounts of all this devastation. I mean, look at this quote from a French journalist talking about a world without noise because all the villages were just gone, just chilling stuff. And yet the source material makes a really strong claim that these kinds of terrifying reports were just completely and systematically ignored by the big media outlets in the US. So the reality of the war, it was basically kept under wraps.
Okay, this slide really gets to the core of the whole thing. You had two completely different stories. The official story, the one everyone was hearing, was that the bombing was super targeted, just hitting military supply lines. Simple, right? But then you have the reality on the ground. According to refugee interviews and even a U.S. Senate study that the source points to, it was something else entirely. It looked a lot more like a campaign to completely wipe out the entire basis of civilian society in those areas. Okay, so now let's switch gears to Cambodia. The source material uses the exact same framework here, but it splits the story into two very different parts. We're going to start with Phase 1, which runs from 1969 to 1975. And you guessed it, this is presented as another massive case of creating unworthy victims through a U.S. bombing campaign.
Now, you might hear the defense that this bombing was, secret but authorized. But the analysis we're looking at points out something pretty stark. Cambodia's own leader at the time, Prince Sihanouk, was publicly begging for it to stop. He was literally protesting the killing of his own people. Look at this quote from a press conference he held, a direct appeal. And what happened? According to the source, crickets. His protests were just pretty much ignored by the U.S. media.
And the human cost, it's just staggering. The source we're using cites a Finnish inquiry commission, and their estimate for the number of people who died during this first phase from the bombing and the civil war it fueled was 600,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. 600,000 people. And this right here, this is maybe the most important point the analysis makes. The bombing didn't just cause all this terrible suffering. The argument is that it actually created the perfect breeding ground for the absolute horror that came next. The source says it pushed the population into the arms of the Khmer Rouge, turning the countryside into this massive revolutionary base. It basically handed them, as one scholar put it, the psychological ingredients for a violent and vengeful takeover.
And that brings us to what is really the climax of this whole argument. This is where everything flips. We're now in Phase 2. The Khmer Rouge take power in April 1975. And just like that, suddenly the victims in Cambodia were no longer unworthy. They became worthy victims.
And let's be clear, the horror under the Khmer Rouge was absolutely undeniable. It was a nightmare. That very same Finnish commission we mentioned before, they estimated that during the Khmer Rouge's rule, something like 1 million people died. From killings, from starvation, from disease, 1 million people.
So here it is. This is the smoking gun, the central piece of evidence for this whole propaganda model. Think about it. Phase 1, the US bombing, the media reaction is described as basically silence. But Phase 2, when the Khmer Rouge are in charge, an absolute flood of outrage, and it happened overnight. Now, the source is clear. The Khmer Rouge atrocities were genocide and deserved condemnation. But the argument is that this condemnation happened in a vacuum, with almost no mention of the war that helped put them in power in the first place. It's like a switch was flipped. The victims went from unworthy to worthy.
So, what's the takeaway here? What's the final conclusion from all this? How do you even begin to explain such a massive difference in how the media covered two parts of the exact same tragedy in the exact same country?
Well, it all comes back to this idea called the propaganda model, and the analysis is really clear on this point. This is not some kind of conspiracy theory about guys in a smoky room giving orders. No, it's a framework that says the media system itself, who owns it, who they talk to for sources, the basic assumptions they operate on, all of that creates a set of filters, and these filters just naturally end up producing news that aligns with the interests of the state and powerful corporations.
And so, the cases of Laos and Cambodia are held up as just textbook examples of this model in action. The core argument is super simple when you boil it down. What really matters for news coverage isn't how many people suffer, it's who is doing the hurting, the agency of the violence. If our side is responsible, the story gets buried. If an official enemy is responsible, the story is everywhere, amplified and blasted out. And the ultimate effect of all this, the source concludes, is that it helps justify our own government's actions after the fact.
Which leaves us with one last, big, provocative question. Why does any of this matter now? I mean, these events were 50 years ago. Well, it matters because this framework gives us a critical lens we can use to look at the news we see today, every single day. It pushes us to ask not just what's in the headline, but also what's missing. What stories aren't we being told? And maybe the most important question of all, why not?